Hi, if you're here and you're watching this video, that means that you're looking for some AP Computer Science A-Prep. If you don't already know me, my name is Aditya Anandan. I'm a senior at Irvington High School in Fremont, California. Last year, I took the AP CSA exam digitally and I got a 5. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of what it takes to get a 5 on the exam and how you should prepare and what content you need to prepare. If you're on my YouTube channel, make sure to go check out my Thinkific course. We have practice quizzes, we have worksheets, we have practice tests, and we have these conceptual overview videos that you're going to be watching. We also have some breakdowns on MCQs and FRQs that are going to be really helpful for how to think through problems and how exactly to solve them. So without further ado, let's get to the lesson. Okay, so let's start with Unit 3. Unit 3, the primary concept that we're going to be discussing is classes and object-oriented programming. So let's get straight started with object-oriented programming, what exactly it is. So if you haven't heard of it already, object-oriented programming is OOP. We call it OOP. OOP is essentially just using classes, methods, and variables to sort of encapsulate data in a way that you can easily interact and merge objects and sort of manipulate them, right? So let's just go over the reasons for using object-oriented programming. Think of an object as a block with data within it. This data can be stored within methods. It can be in variables. We will discuss that later. And think of these objects as sort of, they're encapsulated within this sort of block, right? And because they're in this block, they're easily able to be called in another program. They're easily able to, they're easily able to communicate with each other. They're easily able to be used in other classes, other methods. It sort of simplifies programming so that you can, easily access and sort of manipulate data, right? So object-oriented programming is a big deal, whether that's in game design, in cybersecurity, in like sort of just software engineering overall. Object-oriented programming is very, very useful. So it's a good thing to know just in general if you're interested in programming, and it's also just generally something that is very useful overall. It's also very important for the AP exam also, so you probably want to know it. Alright, so the next thing we want to talk about is an object, right? So what exactly is an object? So an object is simply an object. It's anything you can think of. Let's think of an object together. I mean, the object that I'm thinking of is Mario. Well, Mario is an object, right? I mean, he's a plumber. He's an Italian plumber, but yes, he is an object. Not objectifying Mario, but for all intensive purposes right now, he is an object within a game. So Mario is an object. Now think of some properties of Mario. What are some properties that Mario has? He has height. He might have weight. I don't know, he might have the lives that he has left. He might have, I don't know, deaths. We'll keep it simple. We have these 4 things. And now think of some actions that Mario does. I don't know, he runs, he jumps, he dies. Pretty simple way of life, but, that's Mario. All he does is run, jump, and die, apparently. I don't know. He saves Princess Peach. I mean, he's a glorified simp. Okay, yeah. So this is the Mario object. So any of the properties that I've defined, they are variables. So lives, deaths, weight, height, they are variables. Any of the actions that I've defined, runs, jumps, dies, they are methods. So that's simply what an object is. For whatever object you're using, it could be this Rubik's Cube, it could be this headphone set that I have. They all have properties, and you can manipulate those properties, so they all have methods. So when we're getting started with talking about object-oriented, the first thing I want to do is go to the highest level, which is classes. A class is a blueprint that implements an object in Java. It's also a basic template for everything you want to do, and it can contain variables, it can contain methods, and it sort of simplifies them and allows you to access them in other programs. The first thing you want to know about a class is exactly what an instance is. So when you define a class in Java, you will have one program which is called the implementation program, and you will use code in that program in another program called a client program. And this client program is, sorry, my tablet is bugging right now, but so this is the implementation program where you're going to define the class, and this is the client program where you're going to actually create the class. So every time you create a class, remember, it's just a blueprint for an object, right? It's not the object itself. When you want to create the object, you're going to use some of the stuff in that class to create an object, and you're going to manipulate that object within this client program. Alright, so how do we define a class? The first thing we want to do is say public class name, and then within this class name, we're going to have a bunch of variables. We can have int a, int b, we can have string a, we can keep going on and on and on. How many other variables you need? So for Mario, like we discussed, some of the variables might be, they might be height, they might be weight, it might be lives, it might be deaths, or it'll probably be all of them since we discussed them. So you would say all of them within this thing. So that's pretty much it with the basic overview of how to like define a class and define the variables. These variables are called implementation variables because they are properties of the class that are constant throughout. So these are like core properties of your object or your class, right? So you need them to continue, and these are called implementation variables. So make sure that you know what an implementation variable is. Wait, no, it's called instance variables. All right, sorry, I messed up. These are called instance variables because they're created with every instance. All right, disregard everything that I said before about implementation variables. This is an instance variable. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is go one level lower. We want to talk about methods. So what a method is a method is essentially a procedure associated with a class. Like we discussed, it could be running, it could be jumping, it could be dying in the case of Mario. It could be, for this Rubik's Cube, it could be turning it one time. It could be, I don't even know, it could be clicking a mouse button. I don't know. It could be removing stuff from your bank account, adding stuff to your bank account. It could be anything, right? So a method, how you define a method is you say, within the class, you have the same indentation as the instance variables. You would say public static void main. And if you watched our first video of Unit 0, you would know that within this, there would be string args to define a main method. But as of right now, that is a method that is in Java that's going to create something else. But this is just, so that is also a method. If you were curious what you're doing, you're creating a method, but that operates a little bit differently than what we're trying to do here. All right, so let's go over each thing over here and what it's exactly doing. So public is called an access specifier. An access specifier, what it does, it just tells Java whether whatever this this method is going to be public or private. A public method is, well, they're social. They like to mingle. They like to be, accessible to every program out there. If it's a private method, it doesn't like to mingle. It's an introverted method, and it likes to, keep to itself. It'll only be within the class that you define it. You can make variables public or private too, and those are also very important. Like private variables, they cannot be accessed by other classes. You would need something called an accessor method to access them, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So just know that when you're defining instance variables, sometimes it's good to say private or public before them, right? So that's how you define that. That's the access specifier. Before a variable, you would either say private or public. The next thing we have is static or non-static methods. A static method, what it is that it goes to the entire class. It refers to the entire class and not just a specific instance. So when you create an instance, let's take an example of a bank account. So when you create a bank account, the interest rate isn't dependent on a specific instance of the bank account. Like your bank account doesn't change the interest rate, right? The interest rate is something that that is constant for every bank account. Therefore, interest rate would be a method that is static because it refers to the whole class of bank account rather than one specific bank account or one specific instance. of a bank account. Alright, so that's what a static method is. The next thing is void, or in this case what this is the return type. The return type is what the method is returning. So returning is a pretty simple concept. Returning simply just means that you are sending something back from a method. So let's say you're doing some calculation and you want to send back an integer that you've calculated. And what this will do is that if you say return variable name, it'll just return that variable back to your program, and you can store it within another variable. So that's pretty much it. So let's say you have a program and it's returning an integer. You could say int a equals to method, because what this is doing is this is returning a program, and now you're storing that you're storing that return variable into a. If it's returning like a string or something, don't have integer here. Have the appropriate type for whatever you're returning. The next thing is obviously main, which you probably would have guessed this is the name. It can be anything you want. For most methods, the name can be whatever you want. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There's not much to discuss there. And the last thing is inside here, you would have something called, let's make this a different color because it is pretty important. This whatever's inside here, it doesn't always have to be empty. You can have things inside there. That is what is called a parameter. You can have multiple parameters, and what these parameters do is they will have a role to play whatever goes on inside of the class. Okay, so that's pretty much all you need to know. So you have access specifier, static, non-static, return type, name, and parameter list. Okay, and that's how you define a method. Now let's go over what exactly methods do within a class. The first thing is a constructor. The first type of method is a constructor. And a constructor creates the instance of a class. Now we've been talking about instance a lot, but we've never really created one. And how you create one is through a constructor method. A constructor method has two things that it needs to satisfy. First thing it needs to have public, or it needs to have public actually, and the second thing it needs to have is the name of the class. This is the one exception to that rule I talked about. You need to make the constructor name the same as the class name, and also a constructor will never be non-static and it'll never have a return type. Don't even put void over there. It should just be blank within here. Okay, so it's public class name. Within a constructor, there are various types of constructors. You can have this blank, which in that case it is going to be a default constructor. A default constructor sets your variables to default values. So in the case of Mario, the height and weight might be 0. The what are the other variables? We said deaths might be 0, lives might be the max number of lives 3. I don't know, but you would just set the variables within here. You would say height, so on and so forth. So make sure that obviously you open the method with curly braces. I don't know what's wrong with my curly braces. I can never do them correctly. I don't know, whatever. But you would set them to default values. The next constructor we want to talk about is a constructor with parameters. So a constructor with parameters takes in a couple of variables inside here. You would say int height 1, int weight 1. And we will just close it for there because I don't want to write everything else, all the other variables, but for now we'll just keep it there. And for here, what we're doing is we're taking the input from the client class. So notice when we call this constructor in the client class, we will have to input height 1 and weight 1 into the method. So we can set height equals to height 1. And we don't want this to be height as well, because then Java will get confused. It won't know which one is the real height. We'll say height equals to height 1 and weight equals to weight 1. And now what we have is we have the height and the weight being set to values that the user, or not the user, that the client program determines. So this allows for you to manipulate what object you're creating and the properties of the object that you're creating. You can have different number of parameters. You could have one for deaths, lives. You can have all of them. I don't know. There's a number of variations that can go on with the constructor types. The only thing that remains constant is that there is public and then the class name. Okay, so those are constructors. We know that you can call them and they will create an instance of class. The next thing we want to talk about are accessor methods. So I think I talked about this a little before. You can have something called a private variable, and a private variable cannot be accessed by any other class. Okay, so sometimes a private variable needs to hitch a ride. Sometimes you want to call a private variable, you want to call it over. If you've secured a date with this private variable, you need to send an Uber to go and get it. That Uber is going to be an accessor method. An accessor methods have only one job: to return. We talked about what returning is. Now let's implement what that is. Okay, so accessor methods have only one line within them, and that's going to be return and the variable you want to return. So let's create a variable that is going to be private. I don't know, let's say for Mario, let's make lives a private variable. Lives has suddenly become a private variable, and now we can't access lives anywhere other than this class. Boo-hoo. Okay, now within this, so now define a new method called public, and we have the return type, which can be lives is an integer, right? Yeah, integer. And then we have get lives, and then we have, so we will not have any parameter for the accessor methods because you're really not doing anything that requires parameters, so it's unnecessary. So now we'll have return lives. That's it. Now when you want to get lives and you want to manipulate, not even manipulate, when you want to simply just get lives within your client program, you can call this method. This can be done for any private variable, and I like to think of it like a wingman, someone that, you know, assists the private variable in getting where it needs to go. The last type of method that we're going to discuss is called a mutator method. Mutator methods simply just manipulate the variables. You can have something that is changing the lives, and within the method you would have lives minus equals to 1, which will mean you're decreasing the lives. And many times you will have something as a parameter for the mutator method. Like, let's take a bank account, for example. Let's define a new variable, a new method that says public, we'll make it void, actually. Void deposit, right? So you have a bank account with a certain balance, and now we'll say int AMT. And within this, we only have one thing. We will say balance plus equals to AMT. So what you're doing is you're adding this amount to the balance, which is what it's going to do is essentially what depositing means. You're going to add that deposit to your balance within the bank account. And that's pretty much the goal of this method. It's just mutating. It's mutating the balance variable so that it is appropriate for the circumstance that is going on, which is you depositing money into your bank account. That's simply what a mutator is, and yeah, that's pretty simple. So I think the most important one of these three is constructors, because they can be a little bit hard to understand and to sort of wrap your head around, like, oh, what's an instance, what are constructors are, and they are a pretty big part of the AP exam in general. Like, you might have different constructors being called. It might get confusing at times, but I think the best thing to do is to understand the basics, like what is a constructor, how are constructors different than these other methods, how are default constructors different than other constructors, and then you could work from there and start doing practice problems. Okay, the next topic that I want to talk about is called method overloading, and we did this a little bit when we did constructors, right? So we have the default constructor. The default constructor is unique in that it has no parameters, and then we have this other constructor that has two parameters. Now, height and weight. Now, both of these methods have the same name. How does Java distinguish which one to call? Now, Java knows which one to call because they both have different parameters. All right, so you could have two methods with the same name, but as long as they have different parameters, both of them are valid. Okay, so that's what's called method overloading. If they give you an example on the AP exam saying, is this method overloading, overriding, blah, 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 you would have to determine whether it's method overloading by checking whether are there two methods within the same class with the same name and different parameters. Then yes, this is method overloading. So overloading simply refers to, I'm just going to write this down because it is an important topic. Why did I say overleading? Oh my god. Okay, overloading. Same name, different parameters. Okay? Last thing. This is the last topic for this unit. This unit is a really big unit. It takes a big chunk out of the course itself, and it's also very foundational for everything we're going to be doing next, alright? So, the next thing we want to talk about is scope, and scope is essentially how far is a variable valid? Okay, so you can have a variable that is valid throughout a class, throughout a method, throughout a loop, and that all determines how the variable is defined. Let's go back to the previous unit where we talked about for loops, right? So we say for int I equals to 0, blah, 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 blah. Notice that we are defining this int I variable. We are creating this variable within the loop itself. And what that tells you is that the loop is only valid within this for loop. The loop is only working within this for loop. Sometimes we also did something similar to this when we defined variables within the class itself. We defined those instance variables, and they are valid throughout the entire class. So where the variable is defined is how far the variable is going to be valid. If it's within a method, it's going to be valid for the entire method, class, the entire class, loop, the entire loop. Okay? You won't be able to call that variable outside of the loop. Okay? That's pretty much all that the scope of variables is. I'm just saying this so that you don't get confused. Like if you take a variable that you've defined within a method and try using it in a different method, it will not work. So just be wary of doing that. Okay? That's pretty much it for Unit 3. As usual, if you have any concerns, comments, on how I can teach this better, how I can explain stuff better, leave them down below in the comment section. If you have any other questions, you can email me. If you're on my YouTube channel, make sure to go and check out my Thinkific course. And I think that's pretty much it for this episode. Peace out.